evening. Good evening. It's so nice to see so many of you here tonight. And welcome to the first event in the spring series in the online and in-person events from the Center for Catholic Studies. I want to greet both you who are here in the room. Many of you are my students in RLS T2550, best audience ever, so happy to see you. And those of you who are joining us online, thank you so much for being here tonight. Tonight we continue the tradition of the Bellarmine Lecture, named for St. Robert Bellarmine, patron saint of Fairfield University, a lecture that focuses on our Jesuit Catholic mission and the thinking of the members of the Society of Jesus and those who work alongside them to advance this mission. I am grateful for the presence of members of Fairfield's Jesuit community who are with us here tonight. Please note that there are materials. We have propaganda on the back table announcing upcoming events. I note two of these. A week from tonight, we're going to have an online-only session, the first of 3 on gender and Catholicism, a joint project between the Center for Catholic Studies and Commonweal magazine. Elise Raby is going to be our opening speaker, proud graduate of Fairfield University, class of '08, and now a faculty member at Santa Clara University. After that, we have, at the end of February, Father John Baldwin, a liturgist, will come and he promises not to be snarky, but I can't be sure. He's going to talk about liturgy. Liturgy always brings out wild stuff, and so it'll be great. He's going to say, where is God in the liturgy? This will be a wonderful lecture. This is part of our partnership with America Magazine. But first, tonight's speaker will unpack the way in which the Catholic character of our mission is a driver of that narrative, one particularly suited to our day. I am therefore happy to invite the Reverend Dennis Donahue, director of the Murphy Center for Ignatian Spirituality, to come forward and introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you so much for doing that, Dennis.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome to all you, and welcome to all you online. Tonight we welcome Professor Catherine Punzalan-Manlimos, the inaugural Vice President for Mission Integration at Seattle University. Dr. Punzalan-Manlimos first joined Seattle U in 2004 as a faculty member of the Theology Religious Studies Department and leading the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. She returned to Seattle U in August of 2022 in her current administrative role and as a professor of theology and religious studies, after serving as vice president of mission integration at the University of Detroit Mercy from 2019 to 2022. With a PhD from Notre Dame in systematic theology, she has published essays on Catholic higher education and on women and the Catholic social tradition. She recently co-edited a volume, Why We Can't Wait, Racism in the Church. Professor Punzalan-Manlimos was introduced to Jesuit higher education at the Ateneo de Manila University, where she received an undergraduate degree in physics and a master's degree in theological studies. It was there she discovered theology and Ignatian spirituality, laying the pathway for her consideration of the intersection of religion, science, and the preferential option for the poor. She now focuses her energy thinking about Catholic higher education, particularly Jesuit higher education, and its distinctive contribution to higher educational landscape and the work for social transformation. And she is also a member of the spiritual exercises in everyday life as a prayer companion with retreatants who are doing the exercises. So without further ado, I will welcome up Professor Catherine Punzalan-Manlimos. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you all for making the time to be with me this evening, including folks online. And I know there are a couple of friends that are online right now, but I want to thank especially Nancy. Thank you for inviting me to join you and to give me this impetus to reflect more systematically on my experience of Jesuit education. A helpful exercise for someone in my role as mission officer at Seattle University. What I find myself constantly thinking about these days is how to deliver a Jesuit education to our students given the current context of the university. To answer that question requires attention to the Jesuit educational tradition itself, attention to who our students are, and the context of the institution. There we go. So in a 2006 address, Father Peter Hans Kolvenbach, who was then Superior General of the Society of Jesus, noted that true education really worthy of the name, is an organized effort to help people use their hearts, heads, and hands to contribute to the well-being of all human society. My plan for this evening is to narrate to you my experiences of Jesuit education. My hope is that by sharing my experiences, I'll be able to tease out what I have come to see as important elements of Jesuit education. My hope is that through the narratives, we will see common threads across almost 40 years at 3 different institutions, with the fourth context being the present, which I hope we can imagine together. And Dennis already started to named all the institutions that I'll be talking about tonight. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to Jesuit education. I was born in the Philippines, spent 8 years of my childhood on the East Coast after that, before returning to the Philippines to enter my junior year in high school. This is all very important because this kind of crossing borders is an important part of my narrative. As a senior, applying for and eventually choosing a college, I had 2 criteria. It had to be a school with a great reputation, and it had to offer a course connected to computers. It was 1986, and computer science and computer engineering were emerging fields and were seen to be the path to a lucrative career. Sound familiar? I applied to 2 universities, the Ateneo de Manila University and the University of the Philippines in Diliman. These 2 universities were about a mile away from each other. One was Jesuit, the other was a flagship state institution. Both checked off my 2 requirements, and both accepted me. I wish I could say I chose the Ateneo because my family and I wanted me to have a Jesuit education. As far as I knew, no one in my family knew who the Jesuits were. In fact, I'm first gen from a working class family, and what I knew about college is that you went if you wanted a better future. And there are great schools you want to go to. I chose the Ateneo because the Dominican sister, who was principal of my high school, encouraged me to do so. And my father feared my future at the state university, where the possibility of becoming consumed with activism and being drawn into communist movements worried him. Actually, the truth is I chose the Ateneo because they accepted me first. I've got to accept that. Nothing more complicated. So I was introduced to Jesuit education as a first-year college student at the Ateneo in 1987. The Ateneo was founded in 1859 and counted Jose Rizal, the national hero of the Philippines, among its many distinguished alumni. He was a writer who used the pen as a weapon to level critique against the Spanish colonizers, including the friars who held the Filipino people under colonial rule for over 330 years. Through his writings, he advocated for social change and is credited with inspiring the Philippine Revolution of 1896. There is a contestation around naming Jose Rizal as a national hero, but I won't get into that right now, but it gives you a sense of the context. So, the context of the Philippines. The Jesuits first came to the Philippines in 1581, 50 years after the arrival of the first Spaniards, bringing Catholicism to the country. The Philippines is one of 2 predominantly Catholic countries in Asia, the other being East Timor. The country would be under colonial rule for almost 400 years, including 48 of those under the Americans. And the American rule ended around 1946. Less than 20 years later, Ferdinand Marcos would be elected president and would not let go of the reins of power, placing the country under martial law for 24 years until his peaceful ouster through the People Power Revolution of 1986. I entered the Ateneo de Manila University as an undergrad in 1987. I witnessed with the rest of the country and the world the way prayer and faith and gestures of kindness and kinship defeated tanks and guns and toppled the dictatorship. Images that I couldn't put up there because I didn't have the rights to use these images are images of people handing flowers and food, praying the rosary, celebrating Eucharist. It only took 3 days for these to topple the Marcos regime. Other parts of the world will also see liberation movements, people working to free themselves from colonial rule, from strongmen and oligarchs during the same period in history. The year 1987 also marked a dozen years since the 32nd General Congregation of the Society of Jesus, where the Society declared, and I quote, "The mission of the Society of Jesus today is the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement." And 15 years since Pedro Arupe's address in Valencia to alumni, where he posited the question of whether Jesuit education was producing persons for others who would actively pursue justice and reject privilege, and stating quite clearly that, and again I quote, "Today our prime educational objective must be to form persons for others." Actually, he used the word men because he was just talking to men, but allow me to continue. "Persons who will live not for themselves, but for God and his Christ. For the God who lived and died for all the world. Persons who cannot even conceive of love of God which does not ensue in love for the least of their neighbors. Persons completely convinced that love of God which does not ensue in justice for others is a farce." When Arupe spoke in 1973, it would have been a year after Marcos's declaration of martial law in the Philippines, and deep into resistance movements often led by university students. Jesuit priests and scholastics, along with the students, would be among those leading the work for social change, conscientization, and liberation. Many in the United States are likely more familiar with the movements in Latin America. The Latin American bishops will have met in Medellin, Colombia 5 years earlier in 1969, where they made explicit that the work of Christ is, in their words, to liberate everyone from the slavery to which sin has subjected them, hunger, misery, all oppression, and ignorance. In a word, that injustice and hatred which have their origin in human selfishness. They went on to note, and I quote, "We will not have a new continent without a new and reformed structures, but above all, there will be no new continent without new people who know how to be truly free and responsible according to the light of the gospel." In 1971, Gustavo Gutierrez published a seminal work, A Theology of Liberation, and the Synod of Bishops published Justice in the World, where they declared that action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of preaching the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. By the time I became a student at the Ateneo, liberation theology was one of the required courses in the core. There were well-established student organizations and movements of work walking alongside the most marginalized communities. Urban dwellers living in informal housing, always in fear of the demolition of their homes. Workers in dangerous working conditions who worked for wages that made survival precarious. Farmers whose families had been tilling lands for generations and yet in constant debt to landowners. And fisherfolk who suffered from degradation of their livelihood because of pollution or because of large fishing trolleys. I entered the Ateneo as a double major in physics and computer engineering. My exposure to core courses in English, history, theology, political science, and economics, among others, awakened in me a curiosity and a desire to understand social situations through various disciplinary lenses. My academic experiences included opportunities to think deeply about the dehumanizing poverty around me that were hard to miss, unless one had simply become so desensitized by what was visible the moment you walked off campus. The learning happened inside the classroom and beyond. The Ateneo spoke about its educational mission as including the pursuit of academic excellence, spiritual formation, social consciousness, and cultural awareness for its graduates. Academic excellence meant preparation for the profession, but it also, more importantly, meant a well-rounded intellectual formation. Thanks to an amazingly rich core that included, get this, 15 semester credits of theology and 16 semester credits of philosophy, along with courses in languages, culture, history, social and natural sciences, and yes, I was a physics major. If you ask Ateneans about what stays with them from their studies, they will say it was their theology and philosophy courses because it was in those courses that they learned to think deeply, not just about the what and how of things, but about the why. My engagement in co-curricular activities immersed me in the lives of many who lived in poverty and precarity, and helped me appreciate the importance of studying history, knowing something about economics and political systems to better understand not only that there is poverty and injustice, but how systems and structures of oppressions came to be, operate, and continue to be perpetuated. With the help of economists, political scientists, sociologists, and professional community organizers who served as advisors and resources to these student organizations, I was able to understand the need not just for charity and service, but for systematic and institutional change. The classroom and co-curricular activities helped me understand that all of this was in the service of faith, that the pursuit of justice was a requirement of faith. I discovered that bringing critical thought to faith, studying scripture and church teachings, had implications for how I was to respond to the social realities other academic disciplines and student organizations were helping me better understand. This is how I fell in love with theology. I have not even mentioned the opportunities for prayer, reflections, days of recollections, and even an 8-day Ignatian silent retreat, not only for students, but faculty and staff. I went to Mass and saw my physics, chemistry, theology, philosophy, history professors preside, and heard I realize I need to make this clear. They were all Jesuits. Sorry, I forgot that we have sometimes lay preachers here. All Jesuits preside and heard preaching that spoke to me and challenged me and were clearly informed by their disciplinary expertise. In fact, the spiritual directors for the 8-day Ignatian silent retreat my senior year were my physics professor and department chair and my history professor, both of whom took the time to get to know me over my 4 years as an undergraduate. In other words, I met Jesuits who embodied the integration that they wanted for their students. And if social consciousness is not fully evident in the stories I've been telling you so far, they were also present in student organizations, right? OSCE was the organization to join. The Office of Social Concern and Involvement was the organization to join if you wanted to become truly immersed in work and work closely with the most vulnerable communities around the metropolis and in nearby provinces. They were the students who were on the streets with workers, farmers, and fisherfolk, marching to demand just wage and safe working condition and land reform and closures of industries killing sea life. We would visit families who were living in precarious housing situations and just spent time with them. Sometimes tutoring the kids, sometimes listening to the concerns of the community leaders, always building relationships. We would reflect on our experiences in the community we visited, attempting to understand the history, the systems and structures that led to and perpetuated the situations, and the demands of faith in the face of these. You getting the pattern? You beginning to see it? As a physics major, I found myself interested not just in physics, but in physics education, and what kinds of research questions were most meaningful for the social reality of the Philippines. And for cultural awareness, for those of you who don't know, the Philippines is comprised of several thousand islands, and we speak almost 200 languages. So you can just imagine the navigation of the cultural reality. Couple that with a colonial mentality and this persistent telling you that actually the Western way is better, right? So there was a lot of work in that area. Maybe I have a particular understanding of Jesuit education because of the time and place I was first introduced to it. I'm willing to acknowledge that. That is in the Philippines, with a Jesuit commitment to the service of faith, where the work for social transformation was named as an absolute requirement, and getting to know many Jesuits who took this to heart and participated in the struggle for liberation as a matter of faith, and using the tools of the university and the intellectual apostolate. This was my period of immersion and introduction to Jesuit education. It was a period that was deeply informed by the spirit of Pedro Arrupe, a spirit that was reflected in his Valencia address. And I can't help but wonder if that education is precisely what we need today. So, the move to Seattle. Between 1998 and 2004, I took a leave from the Ateneo to pursue my graduate studies in theology. And life circumstances led me to stay in the United States. And I was fortunate enough to be hired as faculty in another Jesuit institution, Seattle University. Seattle University has always been keenly aware that it was offering a Jesuit education in a religiously diverse and evenly largely secular context. The service of faith and promotion of justice had to be understood within a multi-faith context. The work was not only to draw out the demands of faith, to resist all forms of dehumanization, but to ask if and how this same call may be found in other faith traditions and in other cultures. The response to the question was already visible in the many multi-faith and interfaith works of justice taking place in the city. It was the university's role to engage with these movements and organizations. This was a period in which lay leadership was in the consciousness of the Jesuits that were at Seattle University. They were very intentional about forming lay leaders to step into the leadership roles of their institution, teaching them about the history of the Society of Jesus, about Jesuit education, about the deep commitment to Catholic social thought, and the institution's commitment to faith that does justice. They made the spiritual exercises accessible to the community. What I came to understand about Jesuit education through my lived experience at the Ateneo, I came to understand more fully through intentional formation programs that help lay colleagues to know the roots of the educational tradition we were invited to contribute to. What I learned from the Ateneo through osmosis, I learned at Seattle University through study and the different opportunities that they had created for us. The context of when I was at Seattle University. Again, I was told from day one, from my first interview to take the position in theology and religious studies, that Seattle is the none zone, N-O-N-E. That is, the response of most people to the question of religious affiliation is they had none. I was told it was the most unchurched region of the United States. In 2004, the historian of Catholicism, Patricia O'Connell Killen, had just co-edited a volume titled Religion and Public Life in the Pacific Northwest, the None Zone, where she posed the question of whether or not what we were seeing in Seattle suggested that the Pacific Northwest was the backwater or the bellwether when it came to religious affiliation. And I think, given what Pew is telling us about religious affiliation today, it's something of a bellwether. When I was in Seattle, I was there for about 15 years before leaving. I highlighted for you in this slide the different events. So I was in Seattle from just right after the impact of 9/11 was being felt. The war on terror was at its height. There was rising xenophobia. This was the period between Bush II all the way to the beginning of 45. The financial crisis happened at this point, right? I list there the different things that are seen at Seattle. The World Trade Organization protest happened just a few years before I arrived. Seattle is the home of Boeing, Microsoft, Starbucks, Amazon. It's a very affluent city, right? It's a very affluent city. And so very different from the Ateneo, right? And yet, even with all the differences between the context of the Ateneo and Seattle, there was something about what I heard and saw during my interview that made the place feel so familiar. I keep bringing up every time I see Dennis, I keep reminding him that he was my very last conversation during my interview. So Father Dennis was a regent at the time, and I was so excited when I had dinner with him because I could talk full Ignatian and just tell him how very Jesuit and Ignatian Seattle University felt. The university has the most succinct mission statement of all the AJCU, I suspect, and it's up there. Seattle University is dedicated to educating the whole person, to professional formation, and to empowering leaders for a just and humane world. In this mission statement, has proven to be attractive to persons who are not religious and who may even be averse to religion. Right? Look at the mission statement again. But I saw the elements of Jesuit education that had inspired me at the Ateneo embedded in this mission statement. In the promise of whole person education, I read the integration of rigorous academic training coupled with spiritual formation and the cultivation of social awareness. Again, I'm hoping you're starting to see the pattern. Students were being prepared to be competent in their chosen fields, but the commitment to empowering leaders for a just and humane world also echoed my experience of educating agents of change who would work for and alongside those working for justice and liberation. Empowered leaders meant, to me, leaders who were competently equipped to undertake the critical analysis of a given situation to arrive at a well-devised solution. This means having the intellectual preparation, not just to have expertise in a single field or profession, but the intellectual curiosity to want to understand complex social problems from different perspectives. It means leaders who have been taught to be persons of reflection and discernment so that they anchor their actions in their deepest source of meaning and ethical orientation. It means persons who are particularly attuned and attentive to the most vulnerable members of our community, of society. Dialogue with cultures and religions. If the era of Arupe shaped my experience at the Ateneo, I entered Seattle University during the period where the impact of the death of the Salvadoran martyrs, the Jesuits who were martyred in the University of Central America, was still being deeply felt by many Jesuit universities in the United States. It was not long after the coming together of what had started off as regional gatherings in the first AJCU Commitment to Justice Conference at Santa Clara in 2000, where Peter Hans Kolvenbach, then Superior General, noted that when the heart is touched by direct experience, then the mind is challenged to change. In his Santa Clara address, he spoke directly to educators from the United States, keenly aware of the context of Silicon Valley, noting, originally founded to serve the educational and religious needs of poor immigrant populations, they, the AJCU institutions, have become highly sophisticated institutions of learning in the midst of global wealth, power, and culture. But he says, nevertheless, the question remains how these institutions can, in his words, express faith-filled concern for justice in what they are as Christian academies of higher learning, in what their faculty do, and in what their students become. The more challenging element in the context of Seattle University was not the expression of commitment to justice, but that this concern is faith-filled. Again, the none zone. Which faith and whose faith, or even what faith? Again, I was told from my interview, right? None zone, none zone, none zone, none zone. And it was the none zone. It really was. And yet, it was at Seattle University that all those opportunities I mentioned earlier to really understand what Jesuit education were given to me. The 34th General Congregation of the Society of Jesus that met in 1995 expanded the idea of the service of faith and the promotion of justice with attention to globalization and by bringing to the fore the need to be in dialogue with religions and cultures. It's here that the Jesuits stated plainly, to be religious today is to be interreligious, in the sense that a positive relationship with believers of other faith is a requirement in a world of religious pluralism. This emphasis on dialogue with cultures and religions expanded my understanding of Jesuit education and Catholicism. I found myself paying attention to those places in the teachings of the church that spoke about the importance and necessity of dialogue. And we hear a lot more of that today, right, from Pope Francis, the importance of dialogue. I was at Seattle University during a period of Jesuit education in the United States, and maybe some will argue this is not over, where the mission of these institutions was often reduced to the promotion of justice, with little reference back to the idea that this was intended to be in the service of faith. It was in this commitment to educating students for a more just and humane world and its instantiation in teaching and scholarship and mission formation that made Seattle University feel like home. But truth be told, while I found much resonance with the institutional commitment, it was not easy to be connected to members of the community who were not benefiting from the economic boom of the city, or who had come to the country not as tech workers, but as refugees or farm workers. When the heart is moved, the mind is challenged to change, Colvin Bach said. But at the time, the impact of systemic forms of injustice was not as visible for those of us whose research was not directly with these communities. My experience of poverty in the global South made it more difficult for me to see and recognize where systemic exclusion was happening in what I experienced in affluent Seattle. I will say that is no longer true. It was no longer true. It isn't currently true if one were to go into the city and see the impact of the economic growth on the exploding number of those who are currently unhoused. I can't miss reading this quote to you from Colvin Bach. In talk at Santa Clara, students in the course of their formation must let the gritty reality of this world into their lives so that they can learn from it, think about it, critically respond to its suffering, and engage it constructively. They should learn to perceive, think, judge, choose, and act for the rights of others, especially the disadvantaged and the oppressed. Affluent Seattle. And then I left. In 2019, I took a position as mission officer at Detroit Mercy. At the time, I knew very little about the city. Actually, all I really knew was that people kept telling me, you don't leave Seattle to live in Detroit. But once I interviewed for the role and visited the school in the city, I was all in. So again, I was coming into an institution in a city that was very different from the one I was leaving. One thing they had in common was their student populations are religiously diverse. What differentiated them is that for most of the students at Detroit Mercy, they were, nevertheless, mostly still religious. Right? I was a member of the Detroit Mercy community from August 2019 to June 2022. Think of those years. That is, during the pandemic year, when things were shut down for a number of months. We all remember being isolated in our own bubbles. And the death of George Floyd brought to the consciousness of the nation and the world what Black communities already knew. That while everyone is willing to acknowledge that all lives matter, the reality felt different because it felt to reflect in too many instances that Black lives matter. And so we had what has been called the racial reckoning of the summer of 2020. That was a period when Laudato Si was getting its legs and the Jesuits had just promulgated their universal apostolic preferences, talking about wanting to be anchored in the spiritual exercises and discernment, accompanying those on the margins, caring for our common home, and accompanying youth towards a hope-filled future. The Sisters of Mercy, too, released somewhere around that time a list of what they named as critical concerns. See, Detroit Mercy isn't just Jesuit, it's also sponsored by the Religious Sisters of Mercy. So both of these informed its mission. And both the Jesuits and the Mercies were always quick to narrate for me that the Jesuits and the Mercies chose to stay in the city after the Detroit uprising of 1967. When I joined the city of Detroit was in the early years of its revitalization after devastating white flight from the city in the uprising of 67, the collapse of the auto industry. The city was struggling after filing for bankruptcy in 2015. It went from a population of almost 2 million to less than half of that, right? So there were sprawling highways, shuttered homes, and shuttered businesses. All of this was impossible to miss. I could travel 23 miles from where I lived to the city in 23 minutes, right? I travel 15 miles in Seattle, it takes me about an hour, right? Because the city had emptied out. What stood out to me about Detroit's Mercy is that it understood itself as being rooted and deeply connected to the city of Detroit and the city's struggle. It understood itself as, it understood the cities as integral to its mission, and it stated this clearly. And here's their mission statement. The second half of it talks about the first half talks about offering its education in an urban context. And then it goes on to talk about the intellectual, spiritual, and social development of their students. Again, are you hearing echoes? Even though my time at Detroit Mercy spanned the pandemic years, and I still can't believe this, I somehow had the opportunity to meet community leaders working for food justice, for climate justice. I met neighborhood leaders organizing to bring services to their children and to their communities, working to remove blight and create community gardens. I joined dental students for an oral cancer walk as they invited those living on the streets to a dental clinic they were offering to those who were unhoused in one of the university parking lots. I joined students for the global climate strike, maybe some of you also participated in that, and helped organize virtual opportunities for faculty and staff to learn about the issues faced by the neighborhoods in different parts of the city. I witnessed the gathering of Indigenous and Black climate activists and the convening of different organizations in the region to talk about Laudato Si and climate change. Some of the pictures you see, the upper right one is the global climate strike. The one in the middle, I joined students, faculty, and staff as they placed an art installation called 1,000 Dolls, representing children separated from their families at the border, and bore witness as students, faculty, and faculty and staff supported students in an annual event they called Bridges, Not Fences, the university surrounded by a fence, that tackles the issues of injustice caused by systemic racism, and saw these same faculty and staff gathering as a learning community to expand their knowledge and their understanding of the history and dynamics of the invisibility, exclusion, and dehumanization of peoples because of their identity. So those are my personal photos. Kolvenbach. We must therefore raise our Jesuit educational standard to educate the whole person of solidarity for the real world. Solidarity is learned through contact rather than through concepts. And you've heard me say this several times now. When the heart is touched by direct experience, the mind may be challenged to change. Personal involvement with innocent suffering, with the injustice others suffer, is the catalyst for solidarity, which then gives rise to intellectual inquiry and moral reflection. For the Sisters of Mercy and the Jesuits still at the university, all of the things I've described were instantiation of missions, a mission rooted in the rich educational tradition and the faith commitments that both orders brought. I often jokingly said to the Jesuits that the presence of the Sisters of Mercy enabled them to remain faithful to their commitment to the preferential option for the poor, of the work for justice, grounded in attentiveness to the struggles of the most vulnerable as a requirement of faith. They would, of course, dismiss such an idea, since this has already been so explicitly embedded in the understanding of Jesuit education since Arupe. Nevertheless, I remain convinced that the spirit of Catherine Macaulay, the foundress of the Sisters of Mercy, and her insistence on attending to the poor person in front of you has helped Detroit Mercy remain anchored in the gritty reality of the city. There is no escaping Detroit Mercy's urban context and the need to understand the history that has led to its decline and to pay attention to the unfolding of its revitalization. The gritty reality of the impact of white flight and systemic racism is inescapable. An institution informed by the commitment of its two sponsors is unsurprisingly deeply attentive to the vulnerable members of the community, orienting so many of their academic programs to be of concrete service to those who live in the city. In addition to service learning opportunities, each schooling college is serving the populations from the region who would otherwise not have access to the kind of expertise the university offers. Through its academic programs and requirements of its students to opportunities for community engagement. RX for Reading, whose mission is to expand access to high-quality children's books and support families reading with their children, has distributed over 250,000 books since it was established 10 years ago. Clinics in the law school, the dental school, the psychology department, all serve the underserved. Their psychology doctoral program will only accept people who can't afford to pay. The School of Architecture and Community Development sees the city as its campus and teaches, among the many technical skills it teaches its students, the art of listening to community members. My brief experience at Detroit Mercy has convinced me that they have understood their educational mission along the lines of what Kolvenbach notes in this quote that I'm showing you. Jesuit education in our current context, I'm almost there. So my intention for this part of the talk was to let you know about my experience of the dizzying change that I saw upon my return to Seattle University. So I went back to the institution I left. I was going to note that I returned to the second year of the first lay president of the university after having two Jesuits lead the institution for 50 years. I was going to tell you that to focus simply on a lay president misses the larger reality of a completely lay leadership of the institution, some of whom were totally new to Jesuit education. I was going to tell you that we have lost so many Jesuits to new missions, to retirement communities, and to their final rest. But that too would not capture the change because so many lay colleagues who have had a long history with the institution and a deep understanding and experience of Jesuit education are also no longer there. I was going to describe the changes around us, from who our students are to attitudes towards religious institutions, attitudes towards oral institutions. I was going to describe the economic boom that's changed the city, not only in terms of its affluence, but the quadrupling of the population of those who are unhoused. I was going to note the global political ethos, advances in technology and impact, especially AI. But this past week and a half has been more dizzying. So instead of attempting to provide a description of the context of our current work in higher education today, I want to tell you about the meditation on the Incarnation, which is found in the second week of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, and invite you to take a moment to describe to yourself what you perceive as the current context of our work, of your work here at Fairfield. I won't ask you to do the meditation with me tonight, I just want to describe it to you. Right? This is the meditation that begins the second week of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And Ignatius invites us to imagine the Trinity, right? Looking down on the world, the three persons of the Trinity looking down on the world. And he invites us to imagine what they see. Right? What do you see? It invites us to imagine, where do we see laughter and joy? Where do we see sorrow and fear? Where is there confusion? It invites us to imagine the world and to kind of just go into different nooks and crannies of it. And I ask these questions of you. Where are there places where the dignity of persons is being crushed? Where is power being wielded unjustly? Where are decisions being made oblivious to the impact on the most vulnerable? Where are those places crying out to God? Where are people organizing to help those who are threatened? Where are the communities being built? Where do you find hope emerging? Where is that place where your unique gift can be offered as a balm? Where do you feel drawn to bring compassion, healing, and love? In this meditation, God decides to come into the world, to its grief and anxiety, to incarnate joy and hope, to enflesh God's love. On some days when I'm most exhausted, or maybe most lucid, it dawns on me that it is ultimately what we are trying to do in this work. To help one another enflesh love. Help our students see themselves as beloved with their talents and gifts, their weaknesses and shortcomings, and help them to grow, to flourish, and to come to appreciate that their flourishing is intimately connected to the flourishing of others, intimately connected to joining in the work of building a more just and humane world. Our work is to empower our students through the whole person education we offer so that they become, and I'm stealing these words, persons of conscience, competence, compassion, and commitment, and enflesh love in our broken and wounded world in their unique way. So let me end with these words from Pope Francis. Oh, you were already looking at them. We can say that today we do not live in an era of change, but rather in a change of era. The situations we live today, then, pose new challenges for us, which sometimes all are difficult to understand. Our times call us to live the problems as challenges, not as obstacles. The Lord is active and at work in the world. You, therefore, go out through the streets and go to the crossroads. Everyone you can find, call them, excluding no one. Above all, accompany those left at the roadside, the lame, the crippled, the blind, the deaf. Wherever you are, do not ever build walls or borders, but piazzas and field hospitals. Thank you.
My dear friend, that was a wonderful tour that was just enlivened by your own intellect, thinking aloud about the journey that you've been on and filling out these dimensions of Jesuit education. I just hope we can continue this and live up to it as fully as you literally embody it for us. It was wonderful. Now we're going to have questions. You love question time, right? We're going to do question time because we have questions. But first, Father Mulroney, would you mind just briefly, if the Jesuits who are here could stand, would you just introduce them, please? Just what is their name and what is their role? We already met Father Dennis Donahue. Oh, don't be shy. We already met Father Dennis Donahue, who is the director of the center, the Murphy Center for Ignatian Spirituality. We have so many students here. Let's just introduce ourselves.
John Savard, Director of Campus Ministry. I also teach in the School of Education. And I also teach a class, Finding God in All Things. We're still looking.
Brother Jonathan Stott, I teach in the Department of Physics.
Gregory Kahn, Special Assistant to the Dean of the Dolton School of Business. No one knows what I do, and I like it that way.
Keeps you out of trying. Is that it there? And Father John, the superior.
Should have introduced myself. I'm Father John Mulroney. I'm the superior of the Jesuit community. I also teach a section of Finding God in All Things, which is wonderful.
We're happy to have you in the Religious Studies Department. Thank you so much. So we have questions here tonight, and straight out of 2 days worth of RLST 2550, Leah, if you would start off.
Hi, I'm Leah, and my question is, how will social media play a role in advancing Jesuit education?
Well, that's an excellent question, Leah. I almost want to ask you that question. I mean, seriously, right? You probably know far better than I would, but I think that we need to utilize it, right? Very definitely need to utilize it. I'm thinking of my own children and thinking of the things where they actually get their news or the information that they cling to. It's definitely not my New York Times app or my Wall Street Journal or Washington Post app. I hear it's in TikTok, it's in Instagram, right? It's in WhatsApp. And so I think we need to utilize those resources to teach about Jesuit education. But at the same time, we also need to look critically at how we use those, right? I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's the answer I have.
Other questions out there tonight?
Hi, I'm Shannon. I'm an education major, and I also come from a Sisters of Mercy background and now Jesuit education background. So I was really inspired by how your beliefs influenced your career choice. So my question to you is, do you have any advice for me on how to carry out my own Jesuit education through my teaching one day?
Oh gosh, in so many ways, right? The first thing that pops into my head as you answer that question is the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, but the principle of cura personalis and our personal care for and attentiveness to who our students are. I think my Jesuit educational experience, the fact that I talked about those two priests who knew me and took the time to get to know me, that had a profound impact on me. One of those priests, the history professor, he and I once sat down for lunch, and he said something really in passing that probably meant nothing to him. He said to me, "You should probably go to graduate school." First gen. I had no clue what that was. But it sounded like he was complimenting me, and he opened a door to something that wasn't even in my consciousness. I think being in education offers us, and that's the reason I got into education, the things that I learned that I got excited about, because these were new discoveries for me. These were the things that I wanted to share, right? And I think as an educator, the things that are exciting you and sharing those with passion and excitement allows us and gives us the opportunity to kind of awaken that kind of excitement and curiosity and passion in our students. So that's my first thought, and I'd love to have a sidebar conversation.
Thank you.
That's great, thank you. Other questions out there? While we're looking for those, I was talking to a group of faculty today, and one of them mentioned how hard it is to get people to reflect on what they're doing, and this is such a critical part of Jesuit education. And that's really what your lecture is, sort of this extended, you know how to reflect on things. You bring a lot of materials to it. And in our education today, we are increasingly encouraged to have students read less, a little less, to keep things short, to move more quickly to usable news, and it's hard to inculcate that spirit of reflection. Any thoughts about that?
First thought, Nancy, as you formulated that question that came to me, was just the exercise of taking a pause. I think one of the gifts that I received at Seattle University from my colleagues when I was as faculty member, from my colleagues in mission, was they taught me how to pause. Literally before we started any event or any meetings, we took a moment to pause. and just to do an internal check-in. How am I arriving into a given space? What are the concerns that I'm carrying with me and potentially burdening me and preventing me from being fully present? And sometimes just taking that time at the beginning of starting something to pause, to locate yourself, to become aware of those around you, and at the end of whatever that thing is, whether it's a class, whether it's this moment, a lecture, taking the time to pause at the end of it and asking yourself, what stays with me? What am I carrying? What touched me? How was I moved? How, by the experience? I'm thinking about that very first question around social media. We have so much access to creating all kinds of noise to prevent us from having to do that, and that's very real, right? That's very real. And I wonder if for those of us who are in the classroom doing these exercises of moments of pause for our students at the beginning and at the end of our classes might not provide them with an opportunity to experience something that they might find difficult trying to do on their own.
Okay, I have a question here, and then Leah will help me with a question over there.
I appreciate the subtitle on one of your slides that this is not an era of change, but a change of era, which I think is from Pope Francis. Certainly it feels like a change of era. Do you think that there is anything that Jesuit institutions need to do in terms of cura personalis to respond to this new era that we're in, that maybe we haven't done before?
You named specifically cura personalis, right? Father Bart over at Boston College wrote this really beautiful article on cura personalis where he describes this notion of cura personalis as really attending to the whole person of our students, right? Their intellect, their spirit. But he also talks about it as really attending to the individual in front of you. And I think in these times, so many people have so many feelings about all that's happening around us. And that kind of attentiveness to the person in front of you, right? Really trying to become conscious of what they're bringing into the space is a huge piece of, I think, what we can do for our students. I think some of us just need to be present to one another in that deep way, right? And the other piece of cura personalis is really having genuine regard and concern for the person in front of you. Not just attending to them, but really genuinely caring for them. Again, I don't know how clearly it came out in at least in snippets of my story. It's those professors, Jesuits in particular, that come to mind, but not just Jesuits, right, obviously, but there happen to be a lot of high impact Jesuits in my life who saw me and saw things in me and potential in me and saw the struggles that I had. And I think that's what we owe our students as well, right? And giving the space for them to try out ideas, giving them the space to make mistakes, but feel safe about it, right? Given all that's happening around us, that could be really personal things happening within them, or they're just struggling to figure out what to do, right? But creating that space where they can come in their most authentic self, right? I think I guess that's one thing I would put forward.
Thanks. My name is Melissa, and really appreciated your storytelling approach. And so you started describing Ateneo and vividly the Jesuit presence and the influence and impact of engaging with them in both the classroom and the chapel, and the power that had. And you said, I think this is what we need now, or something like that. Yeah. So my question is, how do we do that? How do we create the environment that you experienced at Ateneo as we transition to more and more of a lay-led institution? And then my other question is, what does Ateneo look like today? Does it still look like that, or are they also experiencing similar transitions?
So I'm going to say something just with regard to the last piece first before coming back. I think one of the things I realized as I was preparing this talk is I describe things as if I'm just moving through space sometimes, but I'm also moving through time, right? And some of the changes that we're experiencing are changes that are being experienced globally. So I just want to note that, and I'll come back to that. you know, so this is sort of the Vice President for Mission Integration at Seattle University hat, right, coming fully on. I mean, that is exactly the question that I ask, right? Because we need to show up for our students, Layer Jesuit, as whole persons. We need to show up, especially as academics, as not just intellectuals with expertise in particular fields, but as persons who are anchored in deep commitments. And for some of us, that's faith commitments. And students need to know that that exists. We're trained in an academy that tries to secularize the intellectual life. But we're at a Catholic university, right? For many of us, it's the faith that motivates the study. We are trying to find God in all things. Right? We are trying to find God in all things. That's why we're undertaking this academic project. There's gotta be a way for students to be able to see that even in those of us who are lay, right? Who are not Jesuits, who are not ordained. And our commitment to the community, right? I didn't describe these Jesuits, but I saw them working in the community. So the visibility of our own commitments to our students, I think, is a critical piece. And again, the visibility for those of us for whom faith is important, making that something that can be known by the students, I think that's critical as well. The care, the concern, the cura personales, that's something that we should have available for our students. But, sorry, I need to note this because this is something I've learned over a couple of institutions. And we can only do that if we're also offering that kind of care to one another, right? So it's a culture that we create, right? Showing up as our true and authentic selves. The other way I think about it is, at the end of the day, I think I'm starting to realize that each one of us, we're given gifts, right? And our one job in life is to cultivate those and offer them back, right? And for us to show up that way, I think will begin in our particular distinctive ways as laypersons who may be married or who may not be married, who may have children, who may not have children, how we show up, right? But we have to create a culture where that's possible. And that's all of our jobs. There was a second piece. What does the Ateneo look like now? You know, it's going through a lot of the same things and asking a lot of the same questions. But I was like, I'm gonna put down the Ateneo mission statement today because I don't know why I decided to print it out in my notes. And what's amazed me about the Ateneo is it remains very conscious of its own location. Can you indulge me? Let me read you their mission statement.
Okay.
As a university, Ateneo de Manila seeks to uphold, preserve, and communicate truth and apply it to human development and the preservation of the earth. As a Filipino university, Ateneo de Manila seeks to identify with, enrich, and embody Philippine culture and contribute to the development of the nation and the uplift of the Filipinos as part of the global community. As a Catholic university, it seeks to form persons for and with others who follow the teachings and example of Christ, who devote their lives to the promotion of service and justice, especially for those who are most in need of help, the poor and the powerless. As a Jesuit university, it seeks the goal of Jesuit liberal education through the harmonious development of moral and intellectual virtues imbued with the Ignatian spirit. The university aims to lead its students to see God in all things and to strive for the greater glory of God and the greater service of humankind. Ateneo de Manila seeks all these through excellence in teaching, learning, and formation, creation and advancement of knowledge through cutting-edge research and creative work, the cultivation of an inclusive, diverse, and sustainable institution and community, and an expansive and immersive engagement with society. It's not pithy, you're not gonna memorize it, but it speaks to how it understands itself as a university.
Right. That's a very strong culture. And I mean, we're not playing dueling mission statements, but it's very different than Seattle's, right?
It is.
Which is very, can read sort of corporate. It's sort of, we're going to realize ourselves here, which is fine. And you unpacked the depths of it when you talked about it, which is great. But they are really clear that they are a specific project in a specific place,
Yes.
which is exciting.
And it's not, yes, it's educating the students, right? But it's also having an impact in the context that they're in, not just through their students, right? But as a university. It reminds me, is it Polanco who listed like the reasons that Jesuit got into education, sort of the 10 reasons, right? And he talks about, you know, the Jesuits are going to learn by teaching, right? The parents are going to be able to fulfill their responsibilities to their children by being able to get them an education. We're going to be able to shape these young men, right, to become really valuable members of society, and our very existence in a community is going to have an impact on it, not only because of our students and the Jesuits, but people are going to see us, and they're going to do things because we're here, right? And I think that remains the invitation. A lot of our mission statements are very focused on the students, but we don't think about our responsibility as a university as a whole.
Our corporate witness, right, yes. Right. Other questions? Please. Leah? Oh, you have two. You're busy.
Hi, my name is Dan DeLugas, and I'm with the Fairfield University Engineering Department. And I've been teaching over 30 years part-time. I just want to mention, because I see in that slide about the crippled, the blind, over the 30 years I've had students who have been handicapped physically in wheelchairs. I've had a student who was practically blind. I have an autistic student, and I've had other students who have complications. And I just want to mention that we have administered to them and given them an opportunity. I just want to mention that because Fairfield U has done a great job doing that.
Thank you.
Great to hear. Thank you. Thank you. And Aaron?
My name's Aaron. You mentioned the Northwest being, kind of a nun zone, but also very religiously diverse. I'm curious, in your work, for those who are interested to learn more about Catholicism, is there a specific thread, either maybe a thread in Catholic social teaching, or just an intellectual curiosity about Catholicism that you find people are curious to follow as they learn about the Catholic tradition or aspects of Catholic social teaching that that comes up when they first engage with the Catholic tradition? Kind of a top hits list.
Huh.
that you find people are often drawn to this aspect of the Catholic tradition as they first encounter it.
I think a lot of the things that I quote, right, really do draw people. The deep commitment to justice. I mean, the Justice in the World from 1971, where it states very explicitly, right, the work for justice as being constitutive to the faith. I think, and then when you study deeply, sorry, I'm just kind of imagining sort of the class where you begin to actually just begin to unpack things, ideas, whether it's scripture, whether it's a particular teaching of the church with students, just to discover that it is an intellectually engaging tradition. That in itself can bring students in. But sort of broad strokes, I do think Catholic social thought brings students in. The other piece is the Catholic imagination, right? We talk about the sacramental imagination, but it's just the idea of beauty. And again, this idea of finding God in all things, the idea, the possibility of seeing things in their depth, right? I think when she starts speaking, it speaks to something that we all hunger for, right? And I think the richness of the spiritual tradition, there is wisdom here. And I think we all hunger for we have a hunger, and what's here will resonate with some of the things that we know that we're hungry for.
Well, that's a fitting conclusion. I want to thank you so much for a very, very rich presentation. And just to let you know that we have already booked next year's Bellarmine lecturer, and who may not give as wonderful a lecture as this one, but is a wonderful speaker to have here. The president of Fordham University, Tanya Tetlow, will be giving the Bellarmine lecture next year.
I'm so glad I went first.
But we are thrilled, and please let Catherine know how much we appreciate it.
Thank you.